At their widest, the sides are going to be 10 3/4 of an inch wide at the bottom, and they're going to taper up towards the top. So in order to get that width, I'm going to do a glue up of 2 boards. And the first thing I'm going to do is cut this rough stock to rough length. I have all the boards that I'm going to use for the sides cut to rough length. So the next thing I'm going to do is get a nice straight edge on one side, and then I'll rip these to rough width. For now, I'm just ripping these boards to rough width, and I'm ripping them so that they're about 1/8 of an inch wider than I actually need. So at this point, I have all the boards that are going to make up the 2 glue ups for the sides, cut to rough length and rough width. So the next thing I need to do is get one face nice and flat at the joiner, and at the planer, I'm going to plane the opposite face, but I'm not going to take it all the way to its final thickness, because after I do the glue up, I'm going to take them to their final thickness using the drum sander. So after the first pass over the joiner, I can still see some pencil mark right in this section. So I have a little bit of a hollow right here. So I'm going to give this one more pass at the joiner, and that should take care of it. I left the boards about 3/32 of an inch thicker than I actually need. So now I'm ready to do the glue up. So I'm going to get a straight and square edge on one side, and then I'll rip them to their final width. So when I do my glue ups, I only put glue on one of the sides of the mating surfaces. I like to use a clamp on either side to kind of help keep the 2 boards in the same plane. Just a light pressure. So usually after I do a glue up of a panel, I like to take a straight edge and put it up against the side of the glue up and just confirm that everything is nice and flat, and this looks really good. On one of the boards of one of the glue ups, I have what looks to be a bark inclusion. It's a little bit of what looks like a crack, and on the inside you can see the dark color of the bark. Now, what I usually do in this case is when I have one of these and I can't cut it off, I actually need the material, I'll fill it with a dark colored epoxy. I use a 2-part epoxy, and I just smush the epoxy into the crack and then give it a couple hours to cure, and then just scrape it off. Now when this completely cures and I scrape it flush to the surface of the cherry, because the epoxy has a dark color, it ends up looking like bark. So the fix actually looks very natural. I have the sides out of the clamps, and before I take these sides down to their final thickness, I'm going to scrape off the majority of the glue using a cabinet scraper. And I'm also going to scrape off the majority of the epoxy from the little repair that I made. Now I'm ready to take the sides down to their final thickness, which is 3/4 of an inch. As I'm taking these down to their final thickness, I'm going to take really light passes through the planer. That's because just in case after the glue up, the boards have their grain running in opposite directions. Now, if the board is placed through the planer and the grain is going against the direction of the knives, there is a risk of chip out, but if you take lighter passes, you can lessen that risk. Now, if you are having problems with chip out, no matter how light of a cut you take at the planer, you can just send these through a drum sander if you have one available. Before I make the through tenons in the sides, I want to taper the fronts of both sides of the bookcase. So in order to do that, I'm going to need to make a special tapering jig just for this project. And in order to get the taper drawn out onto the side, I went ahead and measured the required distance for the top of the bookcase on this side, and then I just clamped on a straight edge. And now with a pencil, I'm just going to mark the taper, and I'll use that as a guide when I go to make the tapering jig. The tapers actually ended up stopping short of the very end by 1/2 inch, but that's not a big deal. I'll just sand this transition in by hand. In order to make the through mortises in the sides, I'm going to make a template, and I'm going to use a guide bushing. I'm going to make the template from 1/2 inch thick plywood. This opening is 3/4 of an inch wide, and I'm going to use a guide bushing that's 5/8 of an inch in diameter. And I'm also using a spiral bit that's 3/8 inches in diameter, and that'll give me a groove that is 1/2 inch wide. I'm going to route this groove in multiple passes, but I'm not going to go all the way through. I'm going to stop and leave about 1/8 of an inch of material on the bottom, and we'll get the remaining amount from the opposite side later. And for the bottom shelf, I'm going to use a spacer in the very back, and I'm going to use a piece of double stick tape to make sure that it doesn't move around when I'm routing. And this will control the distance of the mortise. Now I just have to do 7 more of these, and then we'll finish it up by coming in from the opposite side so we get a nice clean mortise on both faces. Now if I made the spacers correctly on my jig and also the spacer that I inserted with the tape, we should have 1 3/4 of an inch here and 1 3/4 of an inch here. And that's what we have, very, very close to 1 3/4 on both sides. Now going down the side, we always have 1 3/4 of an inch on the back edge. And because this is tapering, we're also going to have 1 3/4 of an inch on this face, on this side as well. So because of that, because of the taper, the mortises actually get shorter as we go towards the top of the side. So I moved the jig down to the next mortise location, and I switched to the next size spacer. And before you clamp these up, make sure that you always have it square on one edge, and you're always flush at the very front of the jig with the edge of the side. And also make sure that the mark that you placed on the spacer in between the jig lines up with the line on the workpiece. All of these mortises were made on the outside faces of both sides, or the show faces. Now, if you recall, we left 1/8 of an inch in the bottom of the mortise, and the reason why we do that is so that we don't get blowout on the opposite face. If we would have taken all the material out from one side, we would have very likely gotten chip out, and it would have looked not as nice. So we need to come in from the opposite face now. Now, in order to easily locate these mortise locations on the opposite face, I'm going to drill a small pilot hole through the center of the mortise. And then from the opposite face, I'm going to enlarge the diameter of that through hole. And then we'll use a flush trim bit with a palm router. So I need to drill a small pilot hole through the center of this mortise all the way through, and I'm going to use a 5/64 inch drill bit. Now, in order to make it easier to get the center of this mortise with a drill bit, I took a piece of scrap wood and I milled it to 1/2 inch thick. Now, the height of this piece should really be at least as high as the mortise, so you can easily get it in and out. But the dimensions of this thing as far as length and height are not critical. Now, at the drill press, I drilled a hole on center using the 5/64 inch drill bit. I'm just going to place this into the mortise, and then I'm just going to use this as a drill guide to drill all the way through to the other side of the mortise. There we go. Now from the opposite side, I'm going to enlarge this hole with a 13/32 inch diameter drill bit. And I'm going to use this hole as a location to start the larger hole. And I'm going to try to drill as straight up and down as I can. There we go. With a palm router and a 3/8 inch diameter flush trim bit, I'm going to route out the opposite side of this mortise, or this, to make it a through mortise. Now I'm just going to insert the bit into the hole and make sure that it's not contacting any of the sides of the walls of the hole, and then I'm going to turn on the palm router, and the bearing is going to track on the inside of the mortise from the other side, and it'll clean out this opposite face, and we should have a complete through mortise. On the opposite end, I have the workpiece clamped down to my bench to keep this nice and secure. Make sure you have a firm grip on the router when you turn it on, and also make sure that the router bit is not contacting wood. With a chisel, I'm going to square the ends of all of these through mortises, but I'm only going to go through halfway from each face so that I can prevent chip out from the opposite face that I'm chiseling into. Make sure not to make the mortise longer. We only want to square the corners here. Each shelf is going to be a glue up of 2 boards, and I have all the boards for each shelf cut to rough length. Now the next thing I'm going to do is get a nice straight edge on one side and cut all of these boards to rough width. But on the boards that I have sapwood on both sides, like this one, I'm actually going to cut both ends or both sides off and just take the heartwood. Now I need to get one face nice and flat at the joiner, and the opposite face I'm going to plane at the planer. But I'm not going to take the boards down to their final thickness until after the glue up. So at the joiner, I edge jointed each mating surface and got it nice and square to one of the faces, and now I can just glue these together. I have the glue up side of the clamps, and I lightly scraped off the excess glue. Now I'm just going to pass these through the planer, and I'm going to take very light cuts on both faces for the same reason that I took light passes for the sides, because just in case the grain in the shelves is running in opposite directions in the glue up. You want to take light passes to lessen the possibility of getting chip out from the grain running in the wrong direction through the planer. It's time now to cut all of the shelves to length, and thankfully all the shelves are the same length, just not the same width. So the first thing I'm going to do is get a nice square edge on one side on all of the shelves, and then I'll cut them all to length. Now with one side nice and square, I can cut all my shelves to the same length using a positive stop with my miter gauge. And I also should point out that the shelves are not cut to their final width. They're still a little bit wider than I actually need, and I'm going to leave them like that for now. I need to make the tenons on all the shelves next, and I'm going to use a stacked dado set at the table saw in order to do that. In order to get the shoulders on each side of the shelves, I had to raise the height of the stacked dado set. But the stacked dado set doesn't raise up high enough to get the full width of the shoulder, or the full length of the shoulder, and it probably wouldn't be safe to do it anyway. So I'm going to get most of the shoulder now with the stacked dado set, and then I'll have to come back with a regular 40-tooth table saw blade, and then we'll clean up whatever remaining with a chisel. That'll make more sense later. I have one of the sides on my bench, and this is the back edge on this side. And I have the bottom shelf in my hand, and I want to show you guys that the bottom shelf actually needs to be flush with the back of the side. So I need to trim this tenon so that it fits in the mortise. So I need to remove this much from this side and this much from that side so that it's nice and flush with the back. And I should point out that the shoulders for the bottom shelf are not symmetrical. The distance or the length of the shoulder on this side is not the same as the length of the shoulder on this side. So in order to get that material that I couldn't get with the stacked dado set, I switched to a regular 40-tooth crosscut blade, and I set my rip vents the right amount from the table saw blade by first testing on a piece of scrap wood. Now, if your miter gauge fence isn't tall enough and you don't feel like the board is very secure, you could use an auxiliary board that's taller and just clamp it onto your miter gauge fence. And when you're making these cuts, make sure that your hands are completely away from the table saw blade. Don't hold your hand down here and accidentally cut a finger off. Keep your hands further up towards the top of the shelf. In order to get the length of the other shoulder, I'm going to just set the shelf or the back end of the tenon into the mortise, and then with a marking knife, I'll make a mark on the tenon for the other side. Right there. When I cut the remaining shoulder with the normal table saw blade, my 40-tooth blade, I intentionally left the table saw blade lower than the top of the shoulder. So this little bit of material that's left over, I need to remove with a chisel. In order to keep the workpiece steady as I'm chiseling away the remaining amount of shoulder material, I have a clamp at the far end of the work holding the workpiece vertical. So I did a test fit of the bottom shelf and the fit is pretty good, but it's a little tight. I had to take a piece of scrap wood and put it alongside the tenon and give it a few whacks with the mallet in order for it to fully seat. So I think on the tenon cheeks, I might take a little block of wood and some sandpaper and just very gently go over the tenon cheeks. But if you have a shoulder plane, you could probably also use a shoulder plane to take off a little bit of material. Here's a tip. When you're test fitting the fit of the through tenons, it's a good idea to take a chisel and just put a very, very light chamfer on the inside face of the shelf to prevent chip out when you're pulling the shelf in and out. There's a tendency for this corner or this edge to grab the tenon as you're pulling it out, and there's a tendency for it to want to lift. So on the inside faces only, just take a chisel and just break these edges. Just a very, very light chamfer, just enough to prevent the edge from grabbing as the tenon is pulled out. And you wouldn't want to do this on the show face. I intentionally made my tenons a little thicker than I actually need by about 0.010 of an inch, so they're a little snug. So ideally you don't want to have to seat these tenons and their mortises by using a mallet. You want them to go in with hand pressure only. So I need to remove some material on each face of each tenon. Now I've found it's nice to take a pencil and just make marks down the face of the tenon on each side, and then take either a mill file to take light passes on the tenon, or if you have a shoulder plane, you can use a shoulder plane, or you could take a mill file even and then wrap it the end of the mill file with sandpaper, and then just take a small amount of material off of each face of the tenon. And you could watch the progress of your sanding or filing by watching the disappearance of the pencil lines. And as you take a little bit off, take off little by little, and then keep test fitting the tenon and the mortise until you have it just right. Be careful that when you're removing material that you don't drag the file or the sandpaper up against the edge of the shoulder of the tenon. You don't want to disrupt this nice clean edge. Then if you need to get the small amount of material that you couldn't get with the mill file or sandpaper, you can then take a chisel and then just work your way into the very corner of the tenon. If you remember, I said I left all of these shelves wider than I actually need them, and I was planning on trimming them to their final width after I finished the through mortises, and now was the time to trim them to their final width. I have the bottom shelf inserted in its through mortise, and it looks really sweet coming out the other side. So now I need to trim the width of all the shelves, and the bottom shelf is actually supposed to be flush with the back of the bookcase, and it is. Now on the front of the bookcase, all of the shelves need to be recessed back by 1/4 of an inch. So I want a 1/4 of an inch reveal between the front of the bookcase sides and the front of each shelf. And in the back, for the back of the shelves, this shelf, that shelf, and the top shelf actually there needs to be a 1/4 inch reveal in the back as well. So this shelf, that shelf, and the top shelf are not flush with the back. They're pushed in by a 1/4 inch. So there's a 1/4 inch set back here, and there's a 1/4 inch set back here, actually for all the shelves, even this one. So the 1/4 inch reveal in the back is to make room for the back of the bookcase, which we'll insert or put on at the very end. So after ripping that to width, I now have a nice 1/4 inch reveal at the front of the bookcase for this bottom shelf. And now I'm going to do the same thing to the other shelves, but I'm only going to trim the fronts for now. So I finished trimming the fronts of all the shelves so that I have a 1/4 inch reveal towards the front of the bookcase. Now I have the back of the bookcase facing up and I have the bottom shelf inserted. Now I need to make a rabbet in the back of each side, and it's going to be a stopped rabbet in that it's going to stop halfway of the thickness of the bottom shelf. So the rabbet is going to start right here, halfway the thickness of the bottom shelf, and it's going to extend all the way out the top of the side. And this is going to be in the back of each side. And this is so that it can receive the 1/4 inch thick plywood. And then once I have this rabbet completed in the back of the sides, I can then trim the upper shelves to their final width so that they meet the rabbet in the back. This will make more sense later. After I finished the rabbets in the back of the sides, I did a dry assembly. Now I need to finally cut the backs of the shelves to their final width, with the exception of the bottom shelf, which will remain flush with the back. So I'm going to take a pencil and I'm going to make a mark where the rabbet needs to meet flush with the back of the shelves, and that'll tell me where I need to trim them to their final width. Now the shelf is nice and flush with this rabbet that we created earlier. Now I just need to do the same thing to the other 2 upper shelves. I have the lower shelf inserted into the mortise of the side, and I have the back of the shelf and the side facing up. So the back is up. So you can see the rabbet that I created in the back of the side. So the next thing I need to do is make a rabbet in the lower shelf. Now the lower shelf is flush with the side, but I need to make a rabbet so that the rabbet will meet up with the rabbet in the side. That way the plywood can go in and sit flat. And later we'll square up this rabbet so that it's nice and square and everything should meet up nicely with the rabbet in the lower shelf. In order to make the rabbet for the bottom shelf, I'm going to use my stacked dado set at the table saw. But if you don't have a stacked dado set, you could make the rabbet in the lower shelf by doing the same method that we used to create the rabbet in the sides, by using a rabbeting bit at the router table. So to make sure that I have the stacked dado set properly, or the right distance from the fence, I took a piece of scrap wood and I made a test rabbet. Now, in order to see if the rabbet is the right distance, you can just take a flat surface and put it up against the side of the work, and then push the work or your test piece up against the square in this case until everything is nice and flush with the square. Then remove the square and you can feel with your finger the rabbet. Now, if you feel a little bit of a ledge, you might need to adjust your fence again so that everything is nice and flush. I reinserted the bottom shelf and you can see that the 2 rabbets line up nicely. So the next thing I need to do is chop this portion or this rabbet square in the sides. So I'll take this apart and then we'll go to work with some chisels. So you may have noticed that I went a little bit too far with the router bit when I made the rabbet in the side, but this is going to be in the back and nobody will ever see it. So I did another dry assembly of the bottom shelf and the 2 sides just to show you guys what it looks like after the side rabbet is nice and square. Looks really nice. I'm happy with how this turned out. So this is the opposite side, and everything is nice and square and flush. And as I mentioned, I did go a little bit over with the rabbeting bit on this side, but it's not too bad. And again, nobody's going to be able to see that. I'm going to make the mortises next in the top of each side, which will hold the loose tenons, which will secure the top. And I'm going to mark those locations out now. I need to make 2 end grain mortises in the top of each side for the floating tenons. Now to make those mortises, I'm going to use my horizontal mortiser, and I have the workpiece supported on the right side on a roller stand. And here are the finished mortises, 2 per side. Piece of cake. So I need to trace this template onto the side at the bottom in order to make the curve. I have the template attached to the workpiece by using carpet tape. I noticed that the workpiece and the template tilted off of the router table a little bit towards the end of the cut. Use a push block here to make sure that everything remains flat on the router table surface. Now I'm going to swap for a router bit that has the bearing on the top, and I'm going to flip the workpiece and template over so that the template is on the top and the workpiece is on the bottom this time. Now when I go to do the next side, I'm going to start with the template on the top, and I'm going to finish off with the bearing on the bottom. That way I only have to change the bit one more time. I have the through tenon of the bottom shelf inserted in the mortise, and it extends out the side by 1/4 of an inch. So the next thing I want to do is put a chamfer on each side of this through tenon. I made 2 marks on either end of the tenon. Now with a straight edge, I'm just going to connect these 2 marks. But if you wanted to, instead of using a straight edge and making pencil marks, you could probably also get away with using a marking gauge. And I'm going to repeat this process on all 4 sides of the tenon. I'm also going to make a few marks down the front of the tenon at the same distance. Now because this distance on the end of the tenon is the same as the distance to the line on the face of the tenon, when we go to use our hand plane, as long as we follow these guides on the end and the face of the tenon, we should get a 45-degree angle. I'm going to use a block plane to take this material down to our indicator marks, and I'm going to do the long section of the tenon cheek first. If you're lucky enough to have a vise in your shop that you can use to clamp the board in this position, you might find that making the chamfers with the board vertical is a little bit more comfortable to work. I went ahead and did a dry assembly just to see how the tenons look chamfered as they protrude out the side of the bookcase, and everything looks really good. I'm really happy. Now, the next thing I need to do is round over all of the sharp edges, and I'm going to do that at the router table. Now, the only edges that I'm not going to round over are the edges in the back of the shelves. I want those to be nice and sharp when they meet up with the back. Make sure to keep the glue off of the portion of the tenon that will protrude out of the side of the bookcase. And this is 1/4 of an inch from the end. It's the next day and I have it out of the clamps, and we're looking at the back of the bookcase, and I just wanted to highlight to you guys how the shelves are aligned with the sides. Now, the upper 3 shelves are flush with the back of the rabbet. The rabbet is running on the inside of each face of the sides. So the upper 3 shelves are nice and flush with the rabbet, and then the bottom shelf is flush with the side, and the 2 rabbets are flush with each other. I'm going to start work on the top next, and the top is going to have to come from a glue up of 2 boards. And I'm going to cut both of those boards to rough length using the miter saw. I'm going to rip both halves of the glue up to rough width, but before I can do that, I need to get a nice straight and flat edge on one side. The next thing I need to do is cut the top to its final width. And I always like to keep the same amount of material on each side of the glue up so that the boards are the same width, and it just, to me, it looks a little bit nicer. So when I go to cut it to its final width, I'm gonna take the same amount of material off of both sides. And I have the edge of the top flush with the piece of scrap wood that has the center mark. Now I can just carefully transfer the mark from the tenon, which is seated in the mortise of the side, right to the underside of the top. Right there. And now if I don't move this top, I can transfer this piece of scrap wood to the other side and repeat the process. Now with a square, I can transfer this mark all the way down the width of the top, which is on the underside of the top. This is the back edge of the top, and I've already measured out the distance for the tenon shoulder, and I need to mark out for the length of the rear tenon, which is 1.5 inches long. And these marks will define the position of the second tenon. I'm going to mill the floating tenons next, which are going to be used to secure the bookcase top to the base. Once you have all 4 of your floating tenons, you can test the fit in their mortises, and this one is a little snug. It's a little tighter than I'd like it to be. So I'm going to show you a neat trick that you can use to remove a little bit of material off of each face of the tenon so that it goes in a little nicer. I have a piece of 220 grit sandpaper on my granite surface plate that's nice and flat. Now, if you don't have a granite surface plate, you could do this on your table saw surface or any hard surface that's nice and flat. So I'm just going to take the floating tenon and I'm just going to take a few strokes on either face, on both faces of the tenon, and then just go back and forth testing the fit until you have it where you want it. Using a 45-degree chamfering bit, I'm going to put a 45-degree chamfer on the bottom of the top, on the left side, the right side, and the front. The back bottom of the top is not going to get a chamfer. So I'm going to do this in multiple passes with this 45-degree chamfering bit by starting with the fence forward or more forward than I needed, and then I'm just going to make successive cuts, and each time I'm going to move the fence back until I have the final depth that I need for this cut. I'm going to make the cuts on the end grain portion of the top first, so the left and right side. And I'm going to back up the cut with a piece of scrap wood to prevent tear out. I need to make a rabbet in the bottom edge of the top that lines up with the rabbets in the sides. And with a pencil, I'm just going to make a mark where the rabbet starts on either side of the top. And to make sure the top is properly aligned with the base of the bookcase, I have the top resting on the floating tenons, which are in the mortises of the base. I moved the fence back for the second and final pass, and with a piece of scrap wood, I just confirmed that I have the fence set at the right distance. Now that I have the rabbet complete, I need to square each end of the rabbet so that the plywood can sit nice and flush with the back of the case. And I'm going to do that with a few chisels. Now, it's important when you're chopping this out nice and square that you don't start your cuts by going with the grain. Because if you start your cuts by going with the grain, you risk just cracking this whole thing down the length of the board till it reaches the end. And you don't want that to happen. So your initial cuts should always be cross grain so that you can sever the fibers before you start chiseling in the direction with the grain. I have the top on the bookcase with the floating tenons dry with no glue. I just wanted to show you guys how the squared ends of the rabbet look on the bookcase. Everything looks nice and good. Everything is flush with the rabbets in the side of the bookcase. So this will be ready for the back to go on, and everything should sit nice and flush with the back once it goes on. It should look good. Before I started to work on the back, I went ahead and applied 2 coats of General Finishes Armor Seal to the base of the bookcase. Now this is an oil-based varnish, but you're welcome to use any finish that you like for yours. With the plywood cut to length and width, I can test fit it now in the rabbets to see how the fit is. And that looks pretty good. So before I attach this to the back of the bookcase, I'm going to pre-finish the back with my General Finishes Armor Seal. And again, you can use any finish that you prefer to use, but I just think it would be a lot easier to pre-finish this back before installing it on the bookcase. In order to secure the back to the bookcase, I'm going to use brads. And I'm going to use brads going through the plywood back into each shelf, 2 per shelf, and then I'm going to shoot brads into the rabbets on the sides and then on the top and bottom. Now, in order to get the locations of the shelves from once the back piece of back plywood is on, because I won't be able to see the shelves, I marked the shelves on center, and then I'm going to transfer those marks to a story stick. I have the story stick bottomed out in the bottom rabbet. Now I'll just transfer this center mark on the shelf to the story stick. And then I'll do that for each shelf. Now with the plywood back resting on the bookcase and the story stick on top and still resting up against the rabbet, I can go ahead and mark the locations of each shelf and then fire in some brads. I should point out that the brads that I'm using are 18 gauge and they're 5/8 of an inch long. With the back nailed on into the rabbets, and because the bookcase was pre-finished, including the back panel, there's nothing left to do and the bookcase is ready to be brought inside and we can start using this right away. So look, I really hope you guys enjoyed watching this build series. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask. And I will do my best to get to your question as soon as possible. So that's it. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed this series and thanks for watching.